Yep. So what we're going to talk about a changing society. So now we've finished education, we've finished welfare essentially. We're done with welfare. So essentially we have two massive elements to go. We have a changing society, and then of course we have Thatcher. So that's essentially the two bits we've done. We're really technically halfway through, which is actually pretty impressive if you consider I've pretty much condensed everything as much as I can. But we're going to talk about a changing society, 1918 to 1951, for this bit. My aim is to try and do the whole of a changing society in terms of what section we're looking at this point in time, okay? So that is what we're going to be looking at very, very quickly, okay? So, what was or is British society, okay? So, British society is class, it's all about class alignment. We're a very class-based society, and subsequent de-alignment, okay? Which is a factor in British industry. Back in the day, if you remember, we talked about Victorianism, we're talking about a lot of class-based society. Here we're talking about everyone is kind of in their individual grooves. And as we've talked about welfare, we've talked about how essentially all this class system has kind of been merged into one. Whether it's through wars or whether it's through individual activities or events or elements that make it really, make it very much the same in terms of what people go through in society. And as we've seen when it comes to welfare, we talk about how everyone essentially is involved in that. And that's, of course, what we've talked about in terms of developing a sort of slamming together of classes, okay? So nowadays, for example, there's very few people who consider themselves upper class, apart from maybe like the royal family, and very few people who consider themselves in many ways working class, like we're talking about absolute slum working class, okay? Everyone is kind of developed into what you call sort of lower middle classes, okay? That's kind of what it's like now. So what we have, of course, is the relationship between class and rank. Why I mention rank is in terms of where you basically sit on the pecking order, how well you're doing. Sorry?
You sit on what?
On the pecking order, i.e., what I was talking about is what's better. Is it better to be upper class or is it better to be working class? Now, in certain communities, of course, it doesn't matter if you're working class or whatever. But in terms of like employability, in terms of even in terms of different types of jobs, where you come from defines how much of the slice of the pie you get in society. Okay.
Social transition.
Society in transition, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So there is a relationship between those two, okay, which is how far you're going to get in general, defined by by what class you came from, okay. So we're talking about why things change. Well, of course, one of the elements is industrialization. So you have more identities of class and rank outside of the aristocracy. Beforehand, it was basically us and them, the aristocracy and the peasants. But with industrialization, what you have is the growth of the middle class. And what you have then is essentially a rat race to get to the middle class from almost every walk of society, whether you're right at the bottom or you're in the middle of sorts. So it's all the idea of now, there's a development of the working class thanks to industrialization. We're talking about the 1800s in many ways. Okay? So industrialization has taken the idea of class and rank outside of the aristocracy. Beforehand it was earls and dukes and peasants. Now it's peasants, nice peasants, rich peasants, a villain, and other stuff. Okay? But what we have in Britain, which is, yes?
What about before the Industrial Revolution? That was some sort of middle class then. They just didn't.
Very well, yes, in terms of perhaps the landed gentry, but a lot of the landed gentry were still considered aristocracy. Landowners, a lot of the times, were members of the aristocracy. Okay, so whilst you're right, there are some elements of the landed gentry who did very well for themselves. Very few and far between. A lot of them are aristocracy. Okay, so a lot of lands are owned by the crown, of which is administered by like a duke or an earl. That's why you have like the Duke of Cornwall, Duke of Sussex,
Talk about
Prince of Duke of Edinburgh, Prince of Wales. That's the kind of the idea about it, okay? But with industrialization, now within cities, within small areas, now you can now jump classes. What also we have here in Britain, which is actually quite unique in many ways to the rest of the world, is we have a socio-cultural self-definition of class, okay? Socio-cultural, so social and cultural self-definition, okay? What do you define yourself as? Okay, that's a very good question. But basically, the idea of that is that whatever class you're in is not, you're not predestined with it. You're not preordained. On the continent, it's a bit more different. It's kind of like you're like brandished with that mark for the rest of your life, depending on your class. Okay, in Britain, not the case. In case it's a lot more fluid and has been a lot more fluid for over 100 years. In many ways, it's because when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, we did it first, and therefore our society was able to change, was able to grow, was able to adapt by saying that actually you can define yourselves in different ways, different manners, depending on what you identify as. Okay? So basically, if you think like you are middle or working class, then you are. That's a really, really important thing to think about when it comes to British society, is it's a lot of what you think you become. That's actually a quote from Buddha, funnily enough. So in the 20th century, you have an even greater growth of the middle class. Why? It's because, a lot of the times, it's because there are more opportunities that grow in the 20th century. Okay? Remember we talked about education? Yeah? That's why you can be part of the middle class. If you're the working class, one of the things that stops you is your educational level, is your opportunities. Remember what I said? Opportunities in order to advance yourself, okay? It's a really important thing to think about when it comes to the 20th century. Not only had the 19th century growth, as in the creation of the middle class, now it is growing so that almost everyone is in some way able to access the middle class way of life. Okay. So what you also have is mass media democratizing society. It means that democratizing basically means everyone gets the same amount of information or same accessibility to information. Previously, of course, it's done in newspapers, but how many people can read? You see what I mean? So when you have mass media, you have different types of media. You have print, you have audio, you have lots of different ways that people get their media. So now it's not just a case of buying a newspaper. Now it's, well, if you've got a radio, you're always going to get some sort of media. If you can go to the pictures, got a TV, you can also get some sort of media, okay? So that is now democratizing society, opening it up. So information is more accessible, and we have the creation, as we now know it, of ordinary celebrities. Why do you think so many times now we hear about celebrities dying? It's because we've had almost a generation of what we call ordinary celebrities. Now, previously, back in the 50s and 60s, if you heard about a celebrity who died, it's usually like a king or a queen or a prince or something like that. Now we have ordinary celebrities who die every now and again, like actors, like painters and all that kind of stuff. So again, you have a very massive shift in what society is like. And a reduction in the old values of society. Okay? The old values, remember when we talked about the, was in the last lesson, the Plowden Report? Remember what the Plowden Report was about? When it came to education?
Sorry?
Do you remember what the Plowden Report was about in education? Remember? Just off the top of your head? When it comes to like values and education?
It was, wasn't it, I'm not sure, wasn't it applied? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's the idea of...
The idea of like, not aristocracy isn't really this anymore?
The Victorianism in education, and that should stop, and they should change to more like open values, less discipline and all that. That's what the plan.
Like everyone gets the same education. Thing like that.
Well, yes, but I'm talking about like attitudes and ways of teaching. It's less like formal and rigid, and more like stay space and let do your own thing, all that kind of stuff. What we consider to be very liberal teaching, less discipline and all that. So what I'm talking about is there's a reduction of those old values, as we've seen for the welfare state. The old values of, for example, that if you're ill or you have or if your health is bad, that is something to be shameful about. Now, if you're ill, that is all right, because it's now something that the state is taking responsibility for. If you're poor, it's not. It used to be shameful to be poor, but now
It still is, don't lie.
less so than it used to be.
Yeah.
That's the point. It used to be like one of the biggest shaming things to be bankrupt.
Yeah, but if you think about it, like poor people and poor kids, they still get bullied.
They get bullied, but they're not rejected by society so much, as much.
People are still trying to do things like as back then.
Charity.
Yes, exactly. It's more. It's less like to hell with the poor. Now it's like no, you have to help them. Okay, so that's now gone. That is now gone. Okay, and now even in education, it's like if you can't deal with discipline, we can't teach you. Now it's everyone. It's all about inclusivity when it comes to education. Okay, so and this is definitely a piece of what you call it. It's a debate which long goes on when it comes to changing British society, which you should pretty much keep at the back of your mind when we talk about British society. Is this a social breakdown or is it increased toleration? Is it a breakdown or toleration? Very, very interesting question. A difficult question to pose in many ways. But that's the main thing to think about, really. So let's give you a little overview of British society through this. You might recognise it. It's a very, very small video about the class system in the UK. Has anyone heard of the two Ronnies?
No.
Okay, well, this is quite a little funny, very tiny video.
I don't understand.
I look down on him because I am upper class. I look up to him because he is upper class. But I look down on him because he is lower class. I am middle class. I know my place. I look up to them both. But I don't look up to him as much as I look up to him. Because he has got innate breeding. I have got innate breeding, but I have not got any money. So sometimes I look up to him. I still look up to him. Because although I have money, I am vulgar. But I'm not as vulgar as him. So I still look down on him. I know my place. I look up to them both. But while I'm poor, I'm industrious, honest and trustworthy. Had I the inclination, I could look down on them. But I don't. We all know our place, but what do we get out of it? I get a feeling of superiority over them. I get a feeling of inferiority from him. But a feeling of superiority over him. I get a pain in the back of my neck.
Very silly little sketch, basically showing the idea about what the class system is like. Okay, so
What was the first guy talking about?
the tall person.
Yes. Why was he saying that sometimes he looks up at the middle class?
Oh, that's in terms of who has better breeding. Because it's like inbreeding. It's like they all like sleep with each other, whereas the middle class tend to sleep with other people. That's the whole thing. Preferred outside.
Yeah, because there's a refuge out there.
Okay, but I want this back. This is mine.
Yeah, I know. Trust me.
Okay. Right, I've got to carry on. So, let's talk about the different the classes within the United Kingdom. Okay. So, of course, we have to start with the upper class, the tall guy in that sketch, defined by huge wealth, mostly in land, and separated in education or dress and events. That's how you can tell who is the upper class, okay? Is they have the best education, they dress the best, or the smartest, or the most expensive, and they go to the most expensive events. So we're talking about the horse racing. Well, actually, that kind of changes a bit early. We're talking about, we're talking about like expensive parties. That's the idea.
I've never seen horse racing.
Sorry?
I never seen horse
It's
racing.
quite fun to watch, actually. It's really good. Well, if they ever bring it back.
I don't know what's that.
You know when people who
Ride on horses and you bet which horse wins in the race.
Sorry?
the sport, you know when people like go on horses?
On what?
Horses.
Horses. Oh, like.
Animal. The animal.
Yes.
Ah, cheval, okay.
And they go on it and then they ride it and people bet on them
Yeah?
to see which horse wins.
Yeah?
That's it. Americans call it horseback riding.
Well,
Cheval, okay, yeah.
anyway, so the upper class is joined by members of the royal family, okay? Why was this a decisive factor, do you think? In terms of how, in terms of why, when the royal family joins the ranks of the upper class, why is this a decisive factor?
Because we don't live in an aristocratic society, so they wouldn't fit into the middle class. So
Well, yeah, exactly, but also it just kind of pushes the upper class a bit further away. It sort of solidifies the idea that the upper class are impossible to get into for anyone else. Like the middle class and working class cannot be upper class. It is genuinely impossible.
like for them, for the royal family to be a upper class.
Well, not the royal family, but for anyone else. And the royal family, members of the royal family being the upper class, just pushes that gap even further away.
Or yeah, like someone from the middle class would never be a upper class.
Yeah, of course. That's it. That's the idea. So no matter how rich you can be,
You would
you'll just be upper middle.
class.
Exactly.
Okay. Can you just like, I just tried just 1 minute.
What's it?
Will you go back?
What do I do?
Explaining.
Okay.
Please.
That's all right. I mean, yeah. So it's worth knowing about the upper class. There's a lot of them. But what we're going to find out is that their numbers dwindle.
Oh, I just know. I feel like this topic relates to that thing I remember learning it. What's it called?
Go on.
The English, you learn in English GCSE. And it's the Inspector Calls. Yeah, Inspector Calls.
Inspector Calls. Good point,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah.
Because that's all about upper and lower class.
Yeah, and the massive differences between the two in a way. But it's a really good synaptic link. Remember that if ever you want to go into and elaborate on the upper class. Okay. Are you feeling better? Yeah. Should we carry on? Okay. So in World War I, the upper class actually gets hit a lot more than people think. Okay. World War I removed upper class domination. Okay. In fact, they have a disproportionately heavy death toll. Now we have the idea that we have an idea that it's always the working class that gets killed the most in World War I. In terms of sheer numbers, of course. In terms of percentages, actually, that is not the case. In percentage terms, the upper class gets hurt, or they lose more of their own, much more than the working class. That is an absolute
Is it
fact.
only because there's a smaller amount of...
There's less of them, yes. And in terms of percentage dead, the upper class actually gets hit a lot more. Because primarily they're all officers, and it's much better to kill an officer than it is for anything else. Because you lose more from that, okay? So the cost of the war, of course, means that there's less of the aristocrats. There's for example, if anyone's seen the film Kingsman, they present the idea that all these aristocrats didn't have anyone to carry on their wealth.
What does that mean? That word mean? Is it French?
What's that?
Aristocrat.
Yeah, absolutely. It's aristocracy is a French word,
Yes.
or it's aristocracy. What does it mean essentially?
It comes from the word an aristocrat, like someone who's like aristocratic-ish.
Yeah.
And it just means, so basically back in the days in France, just after the end of the Victorian era, I'm thinking the words.
Is it the French Revolution?
Hmm? it would be, so there would be like the normal people like us, and then there would be like the rich people, and then there would be the aristocrats, so they would have a say over the politics and everything, but there wasn't like royal.
Yeah.
Mm.
I
Okay.
think I know it.
So they're not quite the royal family, but they're not like middle class. They're in the middle.
So
Landed gentry in many ways.
yeah.
Yeah, the landed gentry. That's a good term to put it. So not only are there less aristocratic people or less upper class people, but the cost of the war meant higher taxation. And this, of course, hits where the money is. Okay? So, for example, they have a 40% tax on families who own estates of 2 million or more. Okay? So that's a 40%. That is massive. That is a great. There's a giant a chunk of money that is just taken away from the aristocracy. Okay. So what that basically meant, and that this tax actually stays on after the war. Of course it does, because of course the post World War I economic crisis. So what do the landed gentry do? Well, if it's on £2 million plus estates, we'll just sell off our estates.
And then you said,
Sorry,
can you repeat the sentence?
which one?
The last one.
Okay, so when they have a 40% tax on estates worth 2 million or more, or what's the solution to that? Why don't we sell off our estate so we don't have to pay the 40% tax?
What's the estate like?
Estate is like an area of land. Yeah, property.
Oh, so the people that own more than so the people that own the property that what's the word, that value more than 2 million
Yep.
have to pay
40% tax
of their.
of their. Oh, I think it's on their income.
Okay.
I think. So, but that's just far too much. So the landed gentry are selling off almost, and this is what they do after World War I. They sell off almost a quarter of English land.
What's landed gentry?
Landed gentry is like aristocracy.
Okay.
The aristocracy essentially sells off almost a quarter of English land. Just prove to you how much land these people owned. Loads and loads of it. And a quarter of all of England is sold off after the First World War. Sorry? It's to the government in many ways, or to local developers. So, but it's just taken out of the hands of individual people or families, and it's essentially a lot of it is split up. Okay. So the upper class are now having to rely on working over rent. So we're talking about money coming in from those living on the land, living in properties that they own. So it's really now moving away from raising revenue from the land itself. So we're talking about agriculture and all that, and now we're going into just properties. Okay, and they're relying on that as rents. Okay. Sorry.
Like, what do you mean by relying? Like, they can relate.
Relate? No, they're relying on. So basically, the upper class need money, don't they? They've been taxed so much they have to sell off their land. So the land that they keep or maintain is land which is going to have a lot of houses which people are still living on. Okay, so that's how they get their money. They're landlords, so they have a lot of tenants who are renting their apartments or buildings. Tenants, so people renting.
Oh, so upper class have to rent their houses to make money?
Yeah, essentially, yes. Okay. That is essentially how it works. Where did you get it?
He was just telling me like about. Look, he's outside right now. He was just telling me about like what's gonna happen.
Okay.
For them after things.
Okay. So essentially, what the upper classes happens is it's now redefined rather than owning land, but by having property. And the difference between that and owning land itself is that, of course, all the land in England and UK was owned, but now you've changed the definition of upper class to owning property and having lots of people renting. Is it actually makes the upper class more accessible. So now the middle class can now become the upper class. You don't need land anymore, you just need properties. You see what I mean? So you have the upper class essentially is now redefined after the First World War. So once again, this is just further proof that the upper class gets hit much more by the First World War than any other class in terms of sheer numbers of people percentage numbers of people dying, and what happens afterwards. Okay? Among that, they have a loss of political influence. As if you remember way back when we were talking about politics in the House of Lords. The House of Commons now becomes the most important thing, the most important base. And so they lose that political influence themselves through the decline of the Lords and the rise, possibly, of the Labour Party. Okay? In terms of, if you think about it, the Representation of the People's Act, 1918. You're now letting almost everyone, apart from women under the age of 30, vote. And this is going to be diluting the voting power of the aristocracy, the landed gentry, the landowners, the people who previously, from 1832, were only allowed to vote. So they're losing a lot of political influence. Now it's not very fun to be upper class. You see what I mean? And affordable luxuries for all, eventually, we're talking about TVs, fridges, radios, the cinema, lots and lots of different types of leisure activities become more accessible to every class. Now, what's the point of being in the upper class? Now we can all go to see the horse racing.
The
chivalries.
Being even more comfortable.
Yeah.
You know how you can go to cinema, but at the end of the month, if you went to cinema every day, you'd be like, oh, next month I won't do that because I will be cinema trip. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. But has anyone seen there was a TV show on BBC called Dracula?
Yes, I love it.
Was brilliant. Apart from the third episode, which I thought went downhill a bit. But in that third episode, Count Dracula is someone who's is a count. He's a member of the upper class, aristocracy, and all that kind of stuff. And he goes forward in time. Spoiler alert! He goes forward in time somehow, and he goes to this normal house. One up, one down, not exactly very good. It's like a working class house, and he goes, "My God, this is like a lap of luxury, electricity, heating, lots of different appliances." So, what we would consider now to be basic, the 1800s upper aristocracy would consider to be like the necessities in order to be called the aristocracy. That's a really good point.
If you don't mind, I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but I'm just enjoying this. I can't do what everyone's there. So can you explain the loss of political influence?
The loss of political influence, okay. Back in the 1832, under the Great Reform Act, only those who owned land could vote. So we're talking about pretty much all the upper class could vote, and maybe some middle class people. Okay.
Talking about the reform of the Lords and how there was a push to try to hereditary peers and all of that.
Well, that's sort of later on, yeah.
Leading up to it.
I mean, yeah, leading up to it, I suppose it's a big difference. Okay. So essentially, the upper class have pretty much most, if not all, political influence in the UK. As time goes on, the House of Lords gets weakened and the House of Commons becomes more important. And now, because of the Representation of the People's Act 1918, more people, just working class people, can now vote. So that dilutes the upper class influence because there's more working class people and one man, one woman, one vote. Okay? So in terms of percentage people who are allowed to vote, the working class now completely outnumber the upper class. And then they've lost their political influence. So my point is, what's the point of being upper class apart from having money?
So when you say they lost the support of the upper class, could you say that's how the Labour Party kind of wiggled its way in?
Yeah.
Because the Conservative Party was mainly a party for the upper class?
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Conservatives have to spend a lot of time getting all the Liberal votes in order to get back on.
Connect it to politics because we're
Yeah.
talking politics.
For sure. It's really good to think about that. Absolutely. Okay. So, the thing is though, at the end of the day, we still have a continuing culture influence of the upper class. For example, how many of you have seen Downton Abbey?
No, I have not.
You have not, but I bet you've seen something to do with the upper class.
I've seen the jokes, I think.
I saw a Simpson episode where she was watching Uptown Abbey. That's it.
Close. But we still have elements of the upper class in terms of influencing our culture still around today, for sure.
Yeah, there's like movies.
Yeah.
and stuff.
In fact, Downton Abbey has made a movie. But yes, you know, I think Emma was a film that came out recently. So what's that?
King, that movie about King Henry VII on Netflix.
I haven't seen
The
it.
favorite.
The Favourite.
That was funny.
See, but you see, there's loads of movies essentially about the upper class which we're still watching today, which is really fun. Pride and Prejudice.
Dynasty on Netflix.
That's like upper class back in the day. No one cares.
True.
Where
But it influences our culture because it's something we're still watching. You see what I mean? Okay? So anyway, let's carry on. So let's talk about the middle class. Okay? So talk about the middle class. It's defined, basically the middle class is defined by what they are not. Which is really, really interesting to think about. It's not ruling class, it's not the working class. It's everything else. Middle class now becomes a catch-all term. Much more so now. You all probably are considered to be working middle class now.
I'm not.
You're probably working in middle class for sure.
I'm not.
You're probably some form of it though.
I'm not.
You
Yes,
know.
you are.
Middle class is now if you have a uni degree or your parents have.
No, lower middle. You can always be lower middle.
Working class,
I
they
don't
have
think
a
I am.
degree.
Working class, because what we learn in politics and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Working class is like.
Are you talking about B2, ABC, you know?
ABC to DE.
Yeah, I fall under the working class, but
Borderline.
I have like siblings who would be. I have a sibling who's middle class.
Okay.
Okay, but like imagine like now you're studying your A level, you can get to uni, so what are you now?
I mean, when that happens, then.
You'll become middle class.
Yeah.
So you
Okay.
have the opportunity to.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you are middle class.
Like, everyone has the opportunity to become.
Exactly. Well, look, at the end of the day, if you want to know what real working class is, honestly, go to Scunthorpe and you'll find there's loads of them there, for example. You know, we're actually doing pretty well if you're living in London in many ways. But again, it's all relative. It's all relative.
Sir, have you been to Harsden? That's middle class.
Need to Hendon. But so there is a distinction between upper middle class, rich but without land, and lower middle class, which is a successful working class. Okay, so you do have a distinction between those two. Some, of course, are blurred in between those, and that's why we see more of it now. But as the middle class is sort of growing very slowly, you're talking about two very distinct groups, upper middle and lower middle. Okay? Rising standard of living conditions for all erodes moral upstanding of the middle class. Basically, as the sort of general well-being of the entire nation goes up, the idea of having to be middle class in order to be the idea of being the idea of needing to be middle class in order to have access to things, for example, like healthcare, good education, as we've talked about with the growth of the welfare state, makes being the middle class unnecessary because the working classes are now getting what you consider to be the standard for the middle classes. Wouldn't you agree? Completely. So the middle class would be at odds with trade unions, okay? Because the middle classes are at odds with trade unions because trade unions are trying to essentially bring up the status of the working class via their different industries at the expense of the middle classes. That's where the money is. Okay? I mean, it's like that's where the money's going to come from. In order to pay the working class more, where's that money going to come from? More tax, okay, maybe? So that's going to come from the middle classes, isn't it? Because they have the money. Okay? And essentially, the middle class are defenders of conservative Britain. Why? Because the middle class had to pay and work to get there. You're not born into the middle classes, unless, of course, you know what I mean. You're not born into it. You have to work towards getting there. So, very much, absolutely. It overlaps. So, of course, they're defenders of conservative Britain, as opposed to the more leftist viewpoint, which is trade unions and bringing the working class up, rather than, no, you work individually. Okay, so it's like the collective versus the individual. The middle class are all individuals, conservative Britain, Working class or the trade unions,
Right.
much more collective.
It's like your scribe status.
Yeah.
It's basically where you're born and you work your way up to something rather than you're born into it.
Yeah, or entitled to it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Funny enough, was the upper class, of course, gets hammered by the wars. Middle class would actually benefit from the wars. That sounds awful, but they do. With the growth of middle management at home or in the UK rather than on the battlefield, you know, with wars come bureaucracy, and the upper class aren't going to do that. The working class are busy fighting. Well, both of those are. Middle classes are keeping the country running. Okay, and so you have a massive growth of middle management, a massive growth of bureaucracy. Okay, you have more white-collar jobs, as I remember we talked about. More white-collar job roles would swell the middle-class ranks. As technology improves, you need more people to build the stuff. You need more secretaries as more industries grow. More office jobs, you know. So that all comes under the aegis, under the umbrella term of the middle class. Okay. And identity can be seen as those owning houses. Okay, if you own a house, you're pretty much middle class compared to the working class, for sure. Not of upper class because they own houses too.
It depends in what country you live in.
One country.
Yeah, some countries just give you houses.
No, it's just like, you know how it's complicated to have property in London because it's so expensive, but like, I have property, like I'm 19, I have property in Belgium.
Damn, I love that.
You bought it.
It's like, my mom decided to give it to me.
Oh.
Okay. Okay. So, but in the UK, if you own a house, it's you're essentially you're behind middle class. That's the idea.
Is that still? Do you think that's still now?
I think there are much more different dynamics because I mean, look, for example, you can be in a council house and still middle class. Funnily enough,
Yeah.
it's difficult. I mean, you're probably very, very low down, but you're still, I think, within that bracket. Working class, you really have to be at the bottom end of the spectrum. You really do. Nowadays, you do. So, guys, and as we talked about, when it comes to middle class, in terms of like being invited to parties, middle class members in previously exclusive leisure institutions, the middle class now can afford it. Well, in many ways, these leisure institutions need the trade because all this upper class aren't going to them as much because there's less of them.
There's less what?
Do you still need to?
No, sorry, I'm trading outside. Thank you.
There's less what?
There's less upper class people. So in terms of the growth of different leisure industries, they're making it more accessible because they need the money, and the middle class is starting to go there. So that's why you now have a growth of different types of leisure industries that come around, especially in the 20th century, especially with, I keep going with horse racing, yeah.
What is leisure?
Leisure activities like going to,
Relaxing.
yeah, basically like anything that's not work that you go outside and do, that's fun, okay? Leisure.
No, we just said sociology that.
Yeah, no, that's what I was asking because I don't know what it
Oh, just like spending time like.
So anyway, leisure, yeah, that's it. Okay.
Okay.
So that's the middle classes. So now let's talk about the working classes. So we've reached our third element, okay, which is the working class. Okay, so for one thing, a low percentage of working class fought in World War I compared to the other classes in terms of percentages. What do you think that is?
No, what they all died.
No. A low percentage of working class people fought in World War
They
I
didn't fight.
compared to the other classes. Why?
Because they didn't have the same opportunity to like resist.
Is it because you have to be really healthy and fit?
That's one of the main elements. Well done. So it's something to do with health in terms
They
of.
didn't have anything better to do. Like,
No. A lot of working class people were working in the factories, making the stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
You can
So-
do both.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you can't, like, fix, like, you can't be, for example, you can't be, like, you can't, like, do a building and then be expected to work in the building. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean that's not on a massively wide scale, but But when it comes to knowing why there wasn't a bigger percentage, it's because 45% was it, if you remember rightly. 45% of all people in the UK weren't able to fight because they didn't have the right.
I don't know, I just guessed.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. The 45% aren't able to, are not allowed to fight because they don't have the right health for it. Okay, and most of those can come from the working class, so they have to go and work in the factories instead. Anyway, the debates on the impact of the war on the working class are still mixed to this day, whether it's good or bad, whether they eventually got emancipated, they were able to vote, or was it bad in the sense of a lot of them, of course, still died in World War One. So we're comparing the broken promises to them after World War One. Remember, Homes Fit for Heroes, improving a lot back at home, to state intervention after World War Two. Okay, so there's two different treatments of the working class after World War One and after World War Two. And you can say that the working class did much better after World War Two. It's obvious. Okay, in terms of housing, unemployment, health, all that stuff. Essentially, welfare. So you have three tiers of working class. Okay, you have skilled working class, unskilled working class, and the criminal underclass. Okay?
So yeah, this is like 3 kinds.
Three types. There's the top tier, the top level, skilled working. Sorry?
3 parts.
3 parts. Well, 3 parts, but one's better than the other.
Yes.
Yes. So you have those 3. So much like the middle class is separated into upper and lower, working class is 3. Trade unions reflect the success or failure of the working class. How do you think? Is it trade unions that reflect the success or failure, or is it employment?
I think they reflect the success because in a lot of trade unions support the working class.
True, but people who join it's like working class in numbers. If a trade union is bigger, does that mean the working class are getting better, or not?
Well, in terms of what, because if the trade union gets bigger and bigger, does that mean like they're fighting for something? So like.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. But does that mean that the working class is getting worse? They feel they have to join a trade union to make it better.
They need to the companies they're obviously working at aren't supporting them, so in that respect they're getting worse. But as terms of standing together, they're getting better because they're all coming together and fighting for something which they believe in.
For sure, I completely agree. So in terms of looking at trade unions as a statistic, in order to think, is the working class getting better, or is it becoming more organised? Absolutely. Case in point, the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Trade union membership is up, trade unions are striking, the working class is technically doing better, okay, in terms of money. But you can also consider employment, guys. You can also consider employment because in terms of just unemployment, you're more likely to be unemployed if you're working class, aren't you? Just general fact. So if more people are employed, more of the working class are going to be employed, just as a brief statistic. Remember the working class were quite conservative during the interwar period? Do you remember that? And that they weren't exactly that much leftist, they were actually quite aspirational, I suppose, between the wars. And that would of course change after World War II. And reforms would remove the stigma of the working class. Okay, now it's no longer shameful to be part of the working class. In fact, now you have working class culture, don't you? You have working class music artists. You know, people who identify as working class, and that's kind of where their music comes from.
SoundCloud rappers.
Yeah, absolutely. There you go.
Even the one on YouTube, all the rappers outside. The UK drill.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, as you remember, rationing would benefit the working class. Remember that essentially everyone was only allowed to eat a certain amount, but for the working class, that's more than they actually were getting in general in peacetime. Okay, so the rationing would be beneficial to the working class. The working class gains were not great from 1918 to 51, for example, in housing, as we know, because there weren't very many housing projects, and that was one of the big broken promises of after World War One. And between 1918 and 1951, there were no real mass working class protests, aside from, I suppose, the general strike of 1926. Aside from that, I wouldn't really consider that to be too much. Certainly nowhere near as much as the strikes that appear in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the winter of discontent and all that, when you had loads and loads of protests instead, or strikes, of course. Okay. So what I would have got you guys to do is how did the classes fare in a changing Britain? Obviously we can't do that, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly with you now. So with regards to upper, middle and working, you can always tell by the hats. You're thinking about the upper class, how do they lose their dominance? Through many different means, whether it's political changes or economic necessity. Okay? How do they manage to reinvent themselves for modern Britain? You'll find that what they did is they opened their houses. You know the National Trust? Essentially, they sold their houses to the National Trust.
What's the National Trust?
The National Trust basically is an organisation that looks after very old buildings. So what they did was they said, look, we can't afford to maintain it. We'll sell it to you if you let us stay in the house, but we'll let tourists see it. For example, Chatsworth,
Oh, like
Blenheim Palace.
what?
Blenheim Palace.
Also the what's it called? Hampton Court.
Hampton Court, perfect.
Is there anywhere with like a blue circle? Like, you know how they have like outside some buildings, like if you go to Mayfair or whatever, they'll have like blue.
That's a blue plaque. That just tells you what happened in that building. No, National Trust is an actual organisation, which it's I can't remember the logo. The logo is like a plant or like a leaf. I can't remember exactly what it is.
The National Trust of people doing the Big Ben.
No, I don't think so. I'm not entirely sure. But the National Trust basically looks after loads of stately homes these days. But that's what the upper class did. Pretty clever, really. But they just opened up their houses to tourists. The middle classes, how do they manage to dominate the UK? Money, mostly, I suppose. They dominate the UK via money. And how do they benefit from modernisation? Well, how do they benefit from it? Because with the growth of different industries, more middle class people can enter it. Okay? Modernisation means more people, more money, and more opportunities. With the working classes, how do they change from right-leaning to left-leaning? Mostly because of broken promises of when they were right-leaning. You know, where's our houses? Where's our homes after World War I? Fine, we'll go more to the left. That's what happens a lot of the time, actually. Well, actually, it's happening less so now. Actually, what's kind of occurring to this day is that we've been so far to the left, or sort of moving from centre to left, and now that's not really working. We're now going back to the right. Hence why, I don't know if you've heard recently, but Bernie Sanders has pretty much been wiped out by Joe Biden. It's because people generally rejected leftism because there's a lot of, sorry?
Who's
Joe
Joe Biden?
Biden who was Obama's vice president.
Yeah.
And they're both right.
So Obama had a vice president that was also, you know, the jokes like Obama and Biden.
Oh, then
Yeah.
wait, I thought everyone liked him.
Yeah, they do.
Biden? Yeah,
He's not a bad person.
yeah. We won't win though, but
Because
he's probably the closest they'll get.
I saw on Twitter something about Biden, but I don't know who it was. Like he said something about.
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy around him.
There's controversy around everyone. At the end of the day, if you're going to be in public eye, someone's going to find some dirt on you.
Oh, like they did with Bloomberg. Was it Bloomberg? Is he voting? Yeah, they said that he said something about like women, and it surfaced like 20 years ago. And now Nancy Pelosi said out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think he said something about segregation.
Yeah.
I mean.
Mess.
But there you go. That's why people are going a bit more right-leaning, essentially, because the left has abandoned them in many ways, or it's just not worked out well. And were they affected for the better or for the worse in the end? Generally, the working class have fared much better, because the welfare state applies mostly to them. Okay? So it's the idea that actually the general standard of the working class has been raised. No doubt. You know, working class now is nowhere near as bad as working class back then. One of the statistics you can look at is life expectancy. Life expectancy of the upper class has always been around 70 odd. Now it's going to be 110. Middle class is about 70, 75, 80. Okay? Working class used to be 50. Now it's 65, 70. They've seen the biggest jump in life expectancy
And working class.
in the working class. Okay, so it's pretty amazing to think about it. And to what extent did social mobility change the dynamic of these classes? It's now no longer rigid. That's the main thing. Like people able to move amongst classes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah? So it's easy for someone from the working class to go to the middle class, and there's no bar for the middle class to go to the upper class because of land. It's all to do with money, essentially. The more money you have, the more money to go that way. The less money you have,
Higher the hat gets.
sorry?
The higher the hat gets.
The higher the hat, absolutely. Get a bigger hat. Why do you think Lord Buckethead's called Lord Buckethead? Check out his hat. Massive.
Never heard the name before. I
Go-
know the
go-
guy with the
Google it.
mustache is-
Bucket hats are the
Lord Buckethead.
fisherman hats.
I don't know about that, no, but Lord Buckethead.
Like he was an actual person.
Lord
Oh,
Buckethead.
yeah.
Yeah. Google Lord Buckethead. He's been trying to become member of Parliament for a long time. If you saw him, you vote for him.
Why? He has a bucket head.
That's so good. I vote for someone if they had a cool mustache, you want me to be honest with you.
You a bit Hitler.
No, because
Whoa.
they have a cool mustache.
It's been his iconic mustache though.
But it's not that cool, like I've seen cooler. Like you ever seen Poirot? You never seen the murder mystery series Poirot?
Poirot, yes.
Yeah. And his mustache, yeah.
Oh, it's brilliant.
That's sick.
Makes you feel just a bit happy
I'm
when
gonna
you see him.
Google it now.
Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, guys. Okay, because next thing we're going to look at, but that's going to be obviously online, is the new liberal society. Now, that's what we're going to look at next time.